Welcome back with me, Brian. We're in my office, and I'm going to show you now this scrapbook that someone has created, probably in the early 20th century, using an old ledger account book. And you can see underneath where they've pasted in all the articles and poems and so on that they like, the accounting from 1899 that someone did. So I think this album is probably from the teens or the 20s. Well, actually, it could be earlier. This one says 1904, but it could be as late as, say, 1915 or something. But what I'll do now is set it down and just briefly flip through it to give you a rough overview of what's inside. It appears that somebody has cut out all sorts of sayings and stories, like here's Edgar Guest, a famous author, that appealed to them. One of the things that's worth noting as we flip through this is, that's an original little piece of art there, is back at the turn of the century, in the first decade of the 20th century, color was still not dominant in printing. Well, this is interesting, 1934. So it's really hard to say when someone has done this. But what's interesting is, if you'll notice, the vast majority of what's in here is monochromatic or black and white. And that is because all through printing history, color has been very expensive no matter how it's produced, whether it's color lithography, hand coloring, block printing by color, or using colored inks. Color in all its manifestations in print is expensive. Even today, color printing is much more expensive than black and white. But in magazines and newspapers of this era, color tends to be used sparingly and the exception rather than the rule. And that's what you see as you flip through old scrapbooks, is the majority of imagery tends to be black and white, except for often it's floral related plants, like in seed catalogs. I mean, there certainly is color used in various publications and advertising, but for the most part, there's a real predominance of black and white. And it has to do, there's a reason for it, and the reason is what I've just basically described, is the cost of producing it meant, and does mean today, that much of printing history is not in color. And this is what we see in an album like this. And this gives you sort of an idea. And it's funny because the color that we do see tends to be either floral or advertising. Right. Yeah, it's all related to either plants and flowers, and then of course there are some images in color, but by and large that's what we see in this album. Whereas today, color is just so predominant, that you just take it for granted. You don't think anything of it. But the history of printing in color is its own separate subchapter of printing history. And there are many books devoted just completely to the production of color lithography by certain workshops, or the rise of hand coloring, or books which contain hand-colored plates in the United States, for instance. There's a whole bibliography devoted just to those, which is interesting and useful. And in fact, it's not all that many books. That's what distinguishes things like the Audubon sets of the 1840s, 50s, 60s, is the extensive use of color, and how expensive they were in their day, and how they're still very expensive to this day, in part because of that. Yes, it's not merely that they're rare or the author is famous, it's that the use of color in such predominance and profusion of it is an expensive book. It's expensive from that angle alone. And so I think you'll have seen just about every page. There's well over 100 pages here. Hours and hours of candlelight reading in your cabin or in your house when you lose electricity and you are reduced to taking out old scrapbooks to read them by candlelight this is one you could have on hand to do just that with. And if this interests you, this scrapbook, one of a kind, is available now online from me, Brian DiMambro.